Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, your source for the conservative view on American politics and culture, and where the issues are discussed with goodwill, candor, and intelligence. And now, here's your host, Tony Codispoti.
Thanks, Duke. This is Tony Codispoti, and I'm here with Volume 69 of the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, entitled The Russian Collusion Mythology. Believe it or not, there are still people who believe Donald Trump colluded with the Russian government to steal the election away from Hillary Clinton. It's kind of astonishing, given the growing list of experts and commentators, all in agreement that Special Counsel Robert Mueller has failed both to make public any evidence pointing to collusion, but more importantly, he doesn't seem to be closing in on any kind of Trump-Russia connection, at least the kind that the Democrats and the left were hoping for. Still, it's not all that surprising when one considers just how people get their news and information today. More often than not, people gravitate toward the news outlet that reflects their political sentiments. Conservatives prefer Fox News. Liberals prefer CNN and MSNBC. The programs on these networks are a mix of commentary and straight news, and the line is often blurred between the two of those things. Social media and regular real-life day-to-day interactions with people regarding political topics often reveals where they're getting their information. People tend to repeat what they heard, especially if it resonates with them, and that's usually a telltale sign of where people are getting their information, because certain things are repeated on certain stations. Now, that's a fact that can be used also as a weapon, especially when the media turns from being an impartial purveyor of news and facts to a partisan distribution of information. When news media organizations lose their impartiality, they can weaponize their news coverage toward a specific purpose. Recent media bias studies done at Harvard University's Shorenstein School of Journalism have shown that how organizations like CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, and The New York Times have overwhelmingly negative coverage of President Trump. Now, they accomplish this overwhelming negative coverage in several different ways. First thing they can do is they can ignore all the positive news that may be available on the performance of the president. They can also cast positive news in a negative light. Another way is that they can focus on negative news to the exclusion of all other news. And one good example of that, and by the way, before I get into the example, that last one is the most insidious form of bias because it ignores the positive news and it only focuses on the negative news. What the news editors decide not to report is bias by omission. News channels are limited to approximately 40 minutes of programming per hour. They have to run about 20 minutes of commercials every hour. Controversializing one story could easily take up an entire broadcast hour of news. If the goal is to run negative coverage of a president like President Trump, that task is made easier by stirring up such controversies. Now, what made this really particularly glaringly evident was literally President Trump's first day in office. On that day, Trump bragged about his inaugural crowd being the largest ever. Now, it was obvious to everyone that it wasn't true. It wasn't the biggest crowd ever. But the news media fixated on it, controversialized it, and by doing so was controversializing an irrelevancy. Besides that, they were ignoring the fact that Donald Trump, throughout his life, has been a notorious exaggerator. he always speaks in superlatives, even when the superlatives don't apply. So this was no different. But the media, because they didn't like Trump, seized on it and focused on it to the exclusion of literally everything else. For weeks, left-leaning news outlets spent airtime arguing with administration officials over the president's characterization of the size of his inaugural crowd. I mean, think about how wasteful that is. Today, everyone is gathering their news from partisan sources. Pretty much every news outlet out there is partisan in one degree or another, some worse than others. CNN is by far the worst. MSNBC is a close second. Fox News is probably the least biased and partisan, but that doesn't mean they aren't biased or partisan. They just do it the least. So everybody's getting their news from a partisan source. And when you focus only on that partisan source, for example, if all you get your news, if the only place you go for your news is Fox News or CNN, you're going to have a completely different set of what you think are facts regarding any particular story, because these partisan news outlets are going to omit certain information that would be key for you to know and understand. This is a problem. This is a very big problem. It's dangerous for people to walk around thinking that they have all the information from their one news source when that news source is not really interested in giving you all the facts, and they're not doing it for a partisan purpose. So it's very damaging on how well informed the public is if they're only focusing on those one or two sources. It reminds me of the quote from Mark Twain where he said, "If you don't read the news, you're uninformed. If you do read the news, you're misinformed." That really seems to be more true today than it ever was. Now, in a previous podcast, I critiqued the case that two liberal reporters were making against Donald Trump, Mike Allen and Jim Vandehey in the Politico. They raised 15 points that they called the case against Trump, and I refuted those points one by one. Now, chief among the flaws in their argument was that none of the 15 so-called facts that they laid out coalesced into a cogent, rational explanation of some kind of overarching collusion effort that was going on between Trump's campaign, Trump and Putin and Russia. It just didn't hold together. I mean, there were 15 unusual situations. You might admit to that much at least, but all taken in aggregate, they didn't amount to some kind of an explanation of what actually went on. So if you ever want to check out my critique of that, it's on volume 58 of the Great Vocal Majority podcast called The Case Against Donald Trump, but in my case with a question mark. Now, what makes the Russian collusion story so preposterous is how Special Counsel Robert Mueller has been conducting his investigation for nearly 2 years, and there has never been any allegation of criminal wrongdoing by the president. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any criminality at all relating to the campaign or to Trump. Mueller was never authorized to investigate an actual crime that occurred. He was authorized on suspicions alone, assigned with looking for a crime. That's not really how these investigations work. Now, just to give you an example for comparison's sake, at this point in the Watergate investigation, Nixon had already resigned the presidency 3 months, and President Ford was in office already. But in Watergate, a campaign office was broken into. There was a crime. Investigators unraveled how the crime came about, and the investigation led to President Nixon. Mueller's task is to find a crime. After 2 years, he's pressured and intimidated people by charging them with making false statements. And through it all, it doesn't seem Mueller is getting any closer to President Trump. Remember, by this time in the Watergate investigation, Nixon was long gone. Still, once suspicions are aroused And while bitterness lingers from the 2016 election outcome, the American public is being manipulated, and they're also being encouraged into entertaining these suspicions, entertaining them without any evidence for so long, lingering suspicions having no factual basis, but are entirely resulting from suspicions, intuition, and guesswork. These suspicions will rise or fall when Mueller issues his final report. But Mueller has some pretty dramatic failures to his detriment. Chief among them, the anthrax attacks where he accused the wrong people. It's still possible that Trump colluded with the Russians. That's not out of the question. Anything is possible. But still, to this day, there is no evidence of anything relating to collusion. All that exists are disjointed exchanges with Russians and their close friends, which doesn't really prove anything. It only arouses more suspicion. All this makes it extremely unlikely that Robert Mueller will conclude that Donald Trump engaged in a conspiracy with the Russians to overturn the 2016 election. For the Great Vocal Majority, I'm Tony Cottaspati. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to this podcast. And I'll speak to you guys soon. I would love to hear your comments. Thanks. Bye.